Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Conscious Grief series. I'm very honoured to be here with Rachel Kelly. Rachel is an author, a speaker, journalist, and a mental health advocate. So thank you very much for joining me today, Rachel.
It's my absolute pleasure.
We are going to follow a slightly different format today, as this is the final episode of this series. And we're going to just have more of a conversation about grief, the series, and just see what comes forward. So it's a little bit more experimental. But I was so interested in the work that you do because you talk a lot about your depression.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really sort of interested in these sort of linking, if you like, griefs and depressions. I'm not to say that it's the same thing by any standard, but I do sometimes feel like we are carrying around a lot of, in some circumstances, a lot of repressed sadness. And in our society, we don't want to necessarily be talking about our deepest, darkest places. And also, in a way, depression and death or grieving. I like all these taboo topics. So,
yes, I mean, there was a wonderful writer called Lewis Woolport. I don't know if you've ever come across his work. And he talked about depression as a kind of malignant sadness. That was his kind of description of it. I think for me, there's a sort of wider point there, which I think you really make well, which is there's a kind of a sort of fear almost of being in touch with our very difficult emotions. And I think that is certainly one aspect of depression, which is being frightened of feelings, being frightened of feelings of sadness and the sort of sense of overwhelm that we won't be able to cope, but also being frightened of feelings of anger. I think that's especially true. I mean, it may be slightly gendered, but one explanation of depression is it's anger turned in. And this is particularly true for women, that they find it really hard to acknowledge and express anger. The counter with men is often that men find it very hard to be vulnerable and express their vulnerability and be in touch with those feelings. But I do think you're right that there's a sort of wider point that it feels frightening to be in touch with anger. It feels frightening to be in touch with feelings, difficult feelings, and that definitely is part of grief. And in fact, I was playing around recently. I'm a bit fed up with the word mental health, because mental implies a sort of cognitive discussion of thoughts, really, our mental, our cognition. And I was thinking maybe we should call it emotional health. Maybe that's what where we're trying to get to, which is just allowing us to be in touch with these feelings.
Yes, I love that. And I was also thinking a bit about, in a way, the misidentification of grief being sadness and sorrow.
Right.
And actually, it's a plethora of feelings. Like you mentioned, anger. There's so many different conflicting feelings which are grief. It's not just everybody sitting in a corner weeping in their bed.
Yes. Yes. And I mean, I know it may be a taboo thing to say, but I think there's even some positivity there. I mean, we, as you say, we think it's just about dark feelings, and indeed it's much more complicated than one single feeling. But, there are aspects of, relief for some people, especially if someone's been in huge pain. I know we've had a couple of really great chats earlier, and I know that we talked briefly about my mum who died 2 years ago. And, she was in a lot of pain and a lot of suffering. And I think that's quite hard to put your hand up and say, actually, there was a sense of relief as well. And even the whole idea that there is such thing as a good death, and what that really means. So, yes, I completely agree. There's a whole range of feelings and emotions, and, some good as well as bad.
Yeah, totally. And then we were talking a bit about, the grieving of identities, which is something I've touched on a little bit in the series, but not much. So we were talking about the identity of becoming a mother and changing. Yeah. So would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I think it's interesting. Well, in both the context of depression and in context of grief and loss and bereavement, this kind of question of identity. In fact, I'm going to send you, and maybe you could share with your listeners later, a really lovely poem that one of the people that I work with. So I run workshops for mental health charities. I'm an ambassador for Rethink Mental Illness and for SANE, and I work with people who are finding life difficult. And this poem is about the change from being a caterpillar to being a butterfly, sort of symbolizing that kind of shift of identity, and making the point that it can be really painful and difficult, even if at the end of it, something really wonderful comes out of it. So I think, when I look back at my own sort of serious depressive episodes, so I had two really, one which was around 6 months or so, found me hospitalized when I was in my 30s. And then I had a second really bad run when I was ill for the best part of 2 years. And that came to the end about sort of a decade ago. And that led to a lot of my books and my writing and things. But yes, when I have been sort of really processing and analyzing, what really happened, because it seemed like everything was tippity top. I had a great job. I was working in the newsroom at the Times. I had 2 children. I was married. I had a house. It seemed like everything was absolutely fine. Yeah, I 100% crashed. And I think there were different things going on, but one thing definitely is this huge shift from being this kind of carefree, career girl, which after all, sort of our generation, well, I'm a bit older than you, but that whole, belief in career really is paramount, ahead really probably of having children. And then suddenly you're in this new kind of almost, you think of children as dependent, but also as a parent, you're kind of dependent on them in the sense that you are, there's a requirement, especially when they're little, to be constantly available, and especially if you're breastfeeding. And again, it's subtle and nuanced, like you were saying, there's a whole range of emotions there, but there is a sense of loss that, you've lost that one identity that you can go out whenever you want and you can work as hard as you want, and you suddenly have lost that kind of part of you. I mean, you have gained a new identity, which is being a mother and what that really means. And certainly in the early years, you are very responsible for this sort of tiny, helpless being. I think that don't know enough about biology, but I mean, I think of all species, I think only elephants are as bad as us in terms of,
The
you know,
long time you
long,
need.
yes, long gestation, we a year, 9-month pregnancy, I think it's 2 years in elephants, but then even little elephants can walk quite quickly on their own, but our children remain dependent, certainly for the first few years. And then, sometimes that identity as a mother can feel really overwhelming. And it's like, it's just too much. Like there's so much that I think I should do as a mother. And I think a big part of my sort of journey, dread word, but a big part of my shifting identity is to take off some of the guilt and feeling of overwhelming responsibility, and to feel more that sort of believe in my children's own ability to develop and grow. And I feel that maybe we can talk more about this, but I feel that there are several trends in society which have made the role of parent quite overwhelming to people, particularly feeling that the world is a scary place and we've got to be on top of our children all the time. Not actually true. In fact, the world is getting safer and safer. I don't know about you, but I mean, I used to walk to school when I was 6, unthinkable now. So that puts pressure on parents to really have that identity as parents. And then there's another big trend, which is the world feels more competitive, and that, this sort of tiger parenting and being on top of children's schoolwork. And so I think that puts a lot of pressure on the identity as a parent. And then you add in the identity as a, somebody who's working, and I was a professional journalist and working in the newsroom, it can be overwhelming, all these different kind of roles we feel we have to play. So I think part of my recovery has been to sort of step back actually from some of those roles and not feel quite so responsible for everybody else, and responsible for the workplace. And, it's not just getting the sports kits bags together, but generally feeling it all comes back to me, because actually it doesn't, and I mean, this might sound radical, but I've come to the view that, for all of us, our main relationship is actually with ourselves, and working on that rather than feeling that I've always got to be, a mother to somebody else, an employee to somebody else. It's always about, being good enough for other people. Well, for me, the big shift is being trying to sort of think, well, if I'm good enough for myself and I look after myself, ironically and counterintuitively, I can actually be better at those other roles and be alongside people. But I've got to start by looking after myself.
Yeah, 100%. I often say that in my yoga classes, we have to fill our own cup because otherwise we can't keep giving from an empty cup. And that's what things like therapy or doing yoga or whatever it is that fills your cup is so important, because otherwise we're just going to be running on empty and not really good to anyone, and certainly not good to ourselves.
Yeah, and I think we've got ourselves into this, a lot of this is about language, and I think the word selfish is really unfortunate because it's got a total connotation of narcissism and not caring about others. And actually we need to kind of reframe it and rethink it. And actually, if you think of it as you say, filling your own cup, like, the kettle, you can't pour if the kettle's empty. I love those visual images. I think they're really important, but there's just shifting that kind of language as well. It's still hard to say it's still hard for me to say that to myself. Actually, I'm going to take a break now. I mean, the phrase I use a lot, I work a lot with mantras, and the one that I use really all the time is I give myself permission. I don't know why I'm feeling quite emotional when I say that, but I suppose it just makes me think of how long I didn't really give myself permission to do these sorts of things.
Mm.
Um,
And I
yeah,
think what was coming forward for me is like you're talking about giving yourself permission, and then the work that you're doing as an advocate of mental health and the books that you have written. It's so powerful because you writing about these things and talking about your inner struggle gives other people permission to say, oh, me too, that I've been really struggling with that. And it's, I mean, I'm not a mother, but I think about this such a lot. I'm very fascinated with this subject.
right,
And I think about how, very few it's not easy for a woman to say, like, I don't like this, I don't want to do this, or I can't wait till they're grown and gone,
right,
you don't want
right,
you don't
right,
want to do that to your children, but like I know it's happening out there. Yeah. and
right.
and that
Yeah, I think, yeah, you make a couple of points there. I think the idea that, yes, I really hang on to that idea that I hope I try and give permission to others, and that, anyone with lived experience of mental illness allows and enables that conversation. And, that is part of defeating stigma. And it's exhausting for people to, um, first of all, deal with whatever condition they're dealing with, but then a second battle to sort of cover it up. So that's a kind of very tiring way to live. But I think back to motherhood, you can give permission to your children as well to, that obviously we all experience all these emotions, back to grief, we do experience sadness, we do experience anger, and the problem is repressing them and shutting them down and not allowing them. And so we can, one of the therapists I work with said, look, I really like working with mums, because if I work with mums, I'm effectively also working with the children.
mm,
And, I think there is something cultural as well, which is that I come from quite a sort of, professional type background. And there's that kind of world. I think it's not quite stiff upper lip. I mean, I think it's changed, but there's more of that possibly, because, like, who are you to have a problem because you seem like you're fine?
yeah.
Whereas if you're struggling to get food on the table, oh, sure, you might be depressed. And
Mm,
even in the world of celebrities, of, I don't know, crazy pop stars, or I don't know, artists. Oh, yes, you might be bipolar, swinging up and down. You've got this crazy lifestyle. But I think the world I'm quite interested in is a kind of middle world, which is sort of, I don't know, journalists, doctors, financial service, so lawyers, people in this middle world who don't seem to have anything
mm,
that they might find difficult, but, they too can really struggle with their feelings. So I think that idea of giving permission. I also, yeah, that second point I think is really interesting as well, about, putting your hand up, and if something isn't joyful to you.
mm,
And I think where I've got to on that, and I'm really working on it. I mean, all these things are a work in progress. I'm so not there. I mean, what is there anyway? I like Michelle Obama apparently says like she doesn't believe in being a grown up. I mean, she doesn't, no, sorry. She doesn't like being asked what she's going to, she doesn't ever ask children what they're going to be when they're grown up, because like we're all growing and learning all the time. But I think for me, back to that idea of emotional health, I think I'm trying to use my emotions as a kind of GPS system, which is if I can line up with what I find joyful in a sort of guilt-free, in a kind of guilt-free way, that again gives permission to other people to line up with their joy. And so it doesn't actually serve anybody if you're doing something that you really don't enjoy at all. They're just going to pick up that vibe. So I think that's been a big change for me as well, which is, watching the shoulds and musts and oughts to, and just trying to think, building that self-awareness and allowing yourself time to think, well, particularly around decision making, like is this really going to be a joyful collaboration? Or actually even working with podcasters and things, people like you, it's like I think I used to just say yes to everybody, but now I do spend a little bit of time think, is this will this be a joyful and fruitful collaboration? So I think very useful to think of our emotions as that kind of guidance system.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, yes, the more sort of aware we become, the easier it is to follow that system, isn't it? Because I certainly know from my experience, I was sort of shut down for so long, wasn't really aware of my inner world much at
Yes.
all. So I was living much more from here instead of.
Tell me how. I'm really interested because it's something I'm working on. How have you got more in touch with your emotions, do you feel?
I think it took me to certain things. I gave up drinking for a year because it wasn't even a stage in my life where I was drinking a lot at all, but I was noticing that I was feeling quite depressed the next day, even after one or two glasses of wine.
Right.
And so then being sober and going into sort of parties and pubs and, being in Britain, and that was probably 7, 8 years ago now, or longer, and all of that anxiety that it brought up, somebody trying to make me have a drink and me saying no thank you, and realizing that I can still have a much broader range of emotions in sobriety all the time. And I think definitely practicing yoga, getting much more in touch with, because I was so separated from my body, for example. Like I just had a lot of self-hatred, a lot of judgment. And so really starting to develop this more nurturing voice within. And like you were saying, you use mantras and mantras or affirmations, doing the mirror work that Louise Hay talks about, sort of developing more of a relationship, firstly with myself, a kind relationship with myself, and then knowing more about what I'm feeling, what's my intuition, what's my fear driving me. And like you're saying, it's a work in practice. I'm not, sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't know, is this my ego, is this what I really want? It takes time.
I use the phrase awake clarity a lot.
Yes.
Like awake clarity, it's not clear, like, and especially with the children, like they ask me about something and they're obviously not sure. We often talk about awaiting clarity. I think something really interesting you touched on there is this sort of somatic bodily experience. And I think that was similar for me, that I was a lot in my head. I went to St. Paul's Girls' School, and we were really kind of, then I went to Oxford, and then I was writing, and so I was forever thinking and writing, and that was where status was to a certain extent in my world. And there are gifts there, we can have cognitive gifts, but I think I've become much more conscious of the fact that there are other gifts as well, and that it's a real gift to live and work and enjoy your body. And I mean, I'm only just starting on it, and I haven't started yoga. I sometimes do a little bit. Both my daughters do yoga, and I just feel that I'm edging there. I'm awaiting clarity to know that that's what I want to do. But I feel in this, trying to connect more physically. I
Mm.
think for me at the moment, the way I tend to do it is more with breathing exercises. And I know that's a big part of yoga as well. So I do quite a lot of meditations, and I particularly was anxious in the mornings when I first woke up. You have that kind of burst of cortisol to sort of get you going. But for me, it often came with fear. So I try now to sort of set an intention and really sort of start the day in a much more peaceful, less frightened way, and to sort of set an intention to just sort of welcome whatever comes, and that it was sort of meant to come. I love poetry actually and the arts, and there's a lovely poem by oh, I've gone completely blank. He's a 13th century Persian mystic, and it's called The Guest House.
Really?
Yes, exactly. And it's it says each day a new arrival, a joy, a depression, welcome each as it comes.
Mm.
It may be a friend from beyond.
I
And I
love
love that idea of just welcoming whatever comes, and just allowing it to exist physically. So feelings do come up physically, don't they? I don't know if you have, obviously, you fear, your heart beats, or
Mhm.
um
Feeling
so
sick
yeah.
in the stomach. And
Yeah.
it's so true because, this is the thing about grief, is that it's an unpleasant feeling. So
Right.
we think, oh, I want to get away from that as soon as possible. And what can I use to get away from it? Whether that's work, busyness, shopping, relationships, traveling.
Yeah.
And so, I guess I did an awful lot of all of those things, um, until I couldn't sort of run from it anymore.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I'd say about like this, all this, in a lot of these interviews, I've asked people about what have been the gifts of grief for
Hmm.
them, but also just like really wanting to reiterate to people who are in a position of grief that it you're not meant to, you're not under any pressure to kind of find the gifts and the lessons and the teaching. This has taken me a long, long time, and a
Hmm.
long, long time of being very unconscious about it, which
Hmm.
is also completely fine because it's a unique experience for each one of us
Hmm.
when
Hmm.
it's our time.
Yeah, I think, I think the word I use a lot is allowing. So just allowing the grief and allowing the sadness. And I think, having worked in sort of mental health now for nearly a decade, I feel often there's a lot of pressure that we've got to be happy all the time.
Totally.
And I've been guilty of it. I've wrote one, my books, some of the book titles. I did one about, I've just happened to be doing something on it this morning. I did one about nutrition and mental health, and it's called The Happy Kitchen. And then I did another one called what did I do? I did one called Walking on Sunshine and Singing in the Rain. In fact, I think I'm more happy with the title of Singing in the Rain, because that at least acknowledges the sort of total interconnectedness of the sadness with the happiness. And I think that's a shift I've made, which is just to sort of, it's just not possible. No one is happy all the time. And that kind of expectation that we've got to sort of be happy all the time is actually another pressure. And the
True.
way I now like to think of it, I've been working with a really lovely psychologist called Dr. Carla Croft, a clinical psychologist, and she runs clinical psychologies for 5 big London hospitals, including Barts. And she always says what she's trying to do is she's trying to get, if you're feeling anxious or grief struck or whatever it is, it's like there's two things. It's you don't want to be on an 8 or 9 out of 10 all the time. It's just bringing it back down to a sort of more manageable level, and acknowledging that it could go back up, but you don't want to be sitting at a very high level chronically all the time. And I like that sort of sense of fluidity, that if you step into the grief, you step out of the grief,
Mm.
like you step into happiness, you step out of it. And also the concept of a kind of rainbow, in the sense that, if we don't have the thunder, the shadow, the darkness, the rain, we don't get these beautiful rainbows in our life.
It's so true. I'm always saying that, like, if you can't have happiness without sadness, because you don't know. You have to have the opposite
Yeah,
of
yeah,
everything. And rather than feeling, yeah, that the negative emotions are all bad, well, maybe not. Maybe those negative emotions are teaching us and showing us, and it really is about our human experience to explore all of these things.
yeah. And I think, if I look back on my experience of this sort of these two really big breakdowns in my life, I mean, I was a good journalist. I enjoyed the Times. It was very exciting. It was very sort of fun in the newsroom in many ways, but it was also incredibly stressful. And I nearly died. It's no exaggeration to say how incredibly ill I was. I mean, I was utterly suicidal, if that's the right phrase, utterly. But just because I felt so incredibly ill, so I really pushed it to the absolute limit. And now I sort of feel that having the breakdowns was a sort of gift, because and amazingly, it actually took me two,
Mm.
because that story and narrative of my background and world of tick this box, pass this exam, get into this uni, get this kind of job, is so strong. And I think it is very strong still for so many people, that even though I was incredibly ill, I mean, I'm saying this now, I actually can hardly believe, I went back to the Times, I went straight back to my job, I didn't actually change anything.
Mm.
And it took the second breakdown, when I was just, I mean, honestly, I can't believe I didn't really pick up the cues.
Well,
uh, that I
that's
needed
what
to
you
do
need. I
something.
mean, with the spiritual psychology that I did, they talk about they call them stackers, if you like. And we
Scat
all stackers,
Statters. Okay.
like a stack of books.
Oh, stackers. Interesting.
And they say, if we come up against something and we don't get it, that lesson,
Yeah.
it will come again, and it will come again, and it will come again and again. So
Yeah.
and
Interesting.
that's what you had to, that's what you needed. You didn't get it the first time. You went back to the same life, and you
Completely.
had to have it again in a bigger form.
Yeah. But tell me, Tara, because you had a similar sort of big shift in your kind of professional life. I mean, I find that the work I do now, working alongside my charities and, sharing some of these ideas and sort of feeling that I'm a kind of communicator for lived experience of what happened and what I've learned. I mean, I find it unbelievably rewarding. And I'm feeling quite emotional again. I mean, as I say, I did enjoy my previous life, but there's literally no comparison to how much I enjoy my work now. I don't know if what I'm just trying to analyze, why is it so rewarding? I suppose it's a bit of a cliche, but you do feel you might make a bit of a difference to people, and that is just hugely enriching as a kind of way to live your life, I suppose.
I think so. I think doing something that's helping other people is a service, and it's a sort of service kind of work.
Yeah,
You're giving back, and I think that fills the cup that we were talking about.
yeah. That's so intriguing that it's actually you're giving out, but actually it's coming back to you as well.
Yeah.
Uh, and it was interesting. I was talking to Sir Anthony Seldon. I don't know if you know his work, but he set up this charity called Action for Happiness, and he was one of the early proponents of mindfulness in schools. And I was saying how much I loved my kind of advocacy work, and I said, do you think you have to kind of work in a charity or some kind of well-being context? And he said, no, not at all. You can bring this approach to
And
whatever is your work. And I thought that was interesting, because sometimes I think I've got almost too excited about this particular sort of world I'm in.
yeah, I do agree with that as well, because sometimes I look back at, so I had the job, the work, the business in fashion, and
Right.
um and I just got to a place with it where I was also felt like I was just working all the time and didn't really have a work-life balance, and really wasn't dealing with something that I was particularly passionate about.
Right. Right.
it was actually, now on reflection, very much part of my grieving process, because I sort of ended up mimicking my mother, you know, having said through my childhood I would never have my own business because the family business dominated our childhood to
Okay.
a degree that that was felt like all we ever spoke about around the kitchen table.
Right.
And then at the end, in my late 20s, I started my own business, and then I was just constantly stressed out and a big responsibility. And I just decided, actually I really wanted to do something with helping people and change completely. But
Was
sometimes
was there a moment? Was there a moment that triggered that sort of shift? I mean,
there was a very specific moment actually in a yoga class where I sort of
okay.
had this kind of moment where I was like, oh my God, I've recreated my mother's life.
Ah, interesting.
And I was sort of ended the class like in hysterical tears, you know, and the teacher was trying to talk to me, and I literally was crying so much I just couldn't talk. And I left and I thought, my God, I don't want to, what am I doing? I don't want this life, you know, I want to change.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. So it was definitely kind of quite dramatic.
It was, but it took us, you know, I didn't change everything in that moment, but I do look back at that business, which was a service actually. And what I was doing was going into people's homes and going into their bedroom, going through their wardrobe and
Right.
selecting items of clothes that they would like to sell. So that in itself was a very personal experience.
Right.
And then I would obviously be talking about the clothes and the was it the weight loss or the divorce or the children with issues, whatever. And it was so personal. And then people would come to my house and they would buy the clothes. So it was a one-on-one. And
Right.
we'd have a cup of tea and we'd talk. And I really loved that part. You know, I was thinking,
Interesting.
oh my gosh, I think she's just buying this pair of shoes because she sat here talking to me for 2 hours. I don't know if she really likes them. And I
Yeah.
wasn't really that interested in selling, I suppose. So
But that's interesting because that's kind of, again, when we were talking about identities, people's different identities and how clothes sort of are a kind of mirror. I remember talking once to a therapist who said that, she could always tell the state of someone's psyche by how they dressed. If they arrived in an old sort of dirty old shirt or, unkempt and uncared for, people's outer mirror kind of does reflect their inner state of mind to an extent. So, maybe with me as well, there were sort of aspects of journalism, like I'm very curious, I like to share information, I like to communicate information. So maybe like you, there were some aspects of my earlier life that really dovetailed really well with my kind of current life.
I think it's true, it dovetails. And I guess there have been moments where I was like, perhaps I could have kept that business going and done the spiritual things that I'm doing now. But then you're like, it's a lot to carry everything,
Yeah,
actually. So,
yeah.
yeah,
And I think there's something there about being on a sort of certain tram line, often with a family narrative. So my mum was also a journalist, and that was like kind of our family on one side of the family had been sort of involved with newspapers. And so, yeah, that sense that you can actually have a freedom to make choices.
that's
I've
true.
really been interested in that recently about, and in a way, even though lockdown's been really hard for lots of people, that for some people it's allowed a sort of, for the first time, they've actually started really consciously making more choice about what they really want and how they want to be going forward.
I know, because it's quite extraordinary how we sort of unconsciously do the things our parents did. So, like, you went
Yeah,
into journalism, I became the little businesswoman, you know, and
yeah,
even though I was thinking, no, I'm not going to do that, or, you know, started
yeah. I mean,
other things in my personal life which are similar to my mum. So we then, I think maybe we get to a place where we say, actually, no, I'm going to do something completely
yeah.
different. Yeah, and set the path for my.
That's really interesting because back to kind of grief. I think that when I lost my mum, and I think that one of the aspects of grief which I've sort of been working on is it was hard for her when I got involved in mental health and this whole field. And I can see that as a parent that you know, if one of my children had very severe depression, it's very hard not to imagine that you as the parent have got some, you know, is it your fault? And I think it was difficult for my mum, that
Yeah.
sort of switch for me. I don't know if that resonates with you. That's one of, I mean, I think we had got to sort of quite a good closure. And I spent a lot of time with her in the last year of her life, and she actually died in my arms, which was amazing in many ways. Um, but I think part of that was, you know, just kind of resolving the fact that I'd chosen something very different, and actually she became really supportive of my work, and she was always really supportive. But I think it, when I look, when I sort of spend more time thinking about our relationship, I think that must have been quite a difficult transition for her,
Mhm.
sort of to go from, you know, oh, my daughter works at the Times, you know, that sounds good, to, oh, my daughter is really ill and she's involved with all these mental health charities, and it's a very different world. So I don't know, maybe that was difficult in your relationship, and you know, we can't have those discussions now, you know, we've lost that chance.
Well, one of the things sometimes I think is sad is, you know, obviously I wish I had my parents here to talk about things, and
Yeah,
at the same time, I've had so much freedom because they
yeah,
haven't been here to sort of decide, oh, I'm going to change and do
yes,
something else.
yes, yes. I think that, yes, back to the sort of panoply of emotions and having so many different ones, that yes, a sort of a kind of freedom and a relief to do exactly what you like. So I mean, I'm become very interested in parenting, and because so many mental health problems happen, you know, about half of all mental health problems happen before the age of 14. So, you know, if we can get to parents and kind of prevention being better than cure. So I've started writing a book about parenting as my next book. And it's interesting because as part of writing about parenting, you know, we bring ourselves, and so you have to look at your own relationship with your own parents, and what, you know, are you mirroring that, and or, you know, how are you different, or how are you the same? And you know, my father, you know, is you know, at a point where he wouldn't challenge what I would do, but I think I probably wouldn't have picked that subject up if my mother was still alive, because it might be too painful. But I think I can now write on my own parenting with a joy and with a perspective, both for, you know, some of the more positive aspects, some of the less positive aspects, but I can write about it in a free way, really.
Yeah, it does. It does give us a sense of freedom.
Yeah, 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 absolutely.
Well, I was just thinking, I was just looking at the time, and I know that you have somewhere to go. So
Oh, Tara,
it's
we could
so
keep chatting.
wonderful. There's more things that I want to talk to you about. I just,
Yeah,
yeah,
well, I agree. I think maybe that just speaks to the fact that it's always an ongoing conversation. There's always more to learn. You know, I've learned from chatting to you, and you know, that's part of the actual, you know, joy of kind of psychological growth, and that grief and loss is part of that, and that we learn and grow, and that's where we always have to just sort of find our kind of peace, really. So
yeah,
I feel I've learned and grown through this chat, so thank you.
same here. And I always say that we are all teachers for one another, and
That's lovely.
very true.
Yeah,
So,
well, it's been an amazing series you've put together, and thank you. I'm honored to be part of it, and you've had some fantastic guests and incredible conversations, so well done you.
well, thank you to you, and I look forward to talking again in the future.
Okay.
And to everybody who has watched this series, I can't thank you enough for your support, for being here, for following the conversations, and I hope to add more at some point. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.